Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and so far on this channel we've covered a number of different class changes happening to many of our favorite playstyles over in the Midnight Alpha. Some of the classes that we've covered has gone through some wild, absolute massive reworks, redefining the playstyle all the way through. However, one of those classes that isn't quite going through nearly as drastic of a change is the class of the Evoker, with Devastation, Preservation, and Augmentation all receiving a number of actually very solid buffs, but not really redefining what makes the core of those playstyles fun and enjoyable, except for maybe the healer spec, since all healers are going through a number of simplifications. But besides this, it looks like there's buffs all across the board for every single way that you can play the Draconic Evoker class. And for today's video, I want to go over exactly everything new that's coming to Evokers for Midnight Alpha so far. As usual, most of these videos with deeper dives are a little bit long, so I do add chapter marks down below so you can skip around to any section you're the most interested in. With that being said, as always, if you guys want to keep up with the basic class changes for Midnight Alpha, soon to be beta, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. Starting out, we have the hero specs, and the first one we're going to go over is the Chrono Warden, and for the most part, they're not really giving Chrono Wardens like anything new if you played them recently. Essentially, what they're doing is giving them that Koresh tier set, which is the current season's War Within tier set of Chrono Boom, where Tip the Scales will have a shorter cooldown. Tip the Scales normally is like a very, somewhat a consequential ability. It just makes one of your empowerment skills every 2 minutes like able to be usable instantaneously instead of having to charge it up all the way. However, for Chrono Warden, anytime you press Tip the Scales, you get this nice haste buff with movement speed and cooldown recovery, so it's actually an offensive cooldown. So for Chrono Warden, it basically means that you can use Tip the Scales more regularly to get the benefits of the temporal burst. So Tip the Scales in a way becomes a cooldown. Further down, we have energy cycles, where temporal burst will grant you essence burst every 6 seconds. So it's really nice. It gives you even more resources and making that burst window even better. And further below that is overclock, where chrono flames will now have a maximum damage and healing increased based on your spell power and versatility. So it's like a scaling increase to deal at least 40% more damage or healing to a cap. So just a nice little buff for the actual ability of the Chrono Flame, especially since with the empowerment skills you can send multiple Chrono Flames at a time. It's just a nice solid buff, but it essentially is an 11.2 tier set reworked as a new set of talents. And the same thing can be observed with Scale Commander, as its basic is also getting its Koresh tier set reworked as a new set of talents on our right hand side, with Commanding Squad, where when you use Breath of Eons or Deep Breath, you are assisted by a squadron of Drakthir who will attack the enemies with pyres, disintegrates, or potentially eruptions depending on your spec. Specifically, below that is Concentrated Power, Mass Eruptions or Disintegrates can strike multiple targets, which makes it very, very strong, as well as Refined Essence, which is a passive buff where Essence abilities simply just deal more additional damage. So it's actually a pretty nice little buff for Scale Commander that heavily plays around the offensive power damage of some of your Essence skills. Next, we have the hero spec of the Flame Shaper, which is a really strong playstyle, though one that can be very, very difficult to play because it initially had the ability of Engulf that would consume either your Fire Breath as a damage evoker or Dream Breath as a healing evoker to do like an explosion of damage or an explosion of healing, and it had a very specific time when you wanted to use that ability. They wanted to make Flame Shaper a bit more passive, or rather, they wanted to remove how many buttons you have to press to play Flame Shaper, but allow you to basically have that same like burst damage through basic rotational skills. So for both Evokers, you either got to get a second charge of Fire Breath or a second charge of Dream Breath, depending on your spec. But they also want to make sure that you don't just have more Dream Breaths, more Fire Breaths, but also find a way to consume those breaths in order to have that mini explosion effect, like the chain reaction effect. So they change the way the Consume Flame works. So for Devastation Evoker, it's now going to work either off of Disintegrate, which you'll primarily use in single target, or Pyre, which you'll primarily use in AoE. So whether you use either one of these abilities, after you apply Breath, using your Essence skills allows it to consume that breath in order to cause it to erupt for additional damage, and it works well for single target and AoE situations. For Preservation Evoker, this will work off of Verdant Embrace as well as your Emerald Blossom ability, so it still has this like single target as well as AoE component as well, where either one of those skills can consume that breath in order to deal additional burst healing. Though for Preservation, you likely will use like Verdant Embrace into a couple Emerald Blossoms, since they are limited in how many you can use. For Devastation, you likely would just use one Essence ability in single target and the other essence in pure AoE, where for preservation it'll likely be like a combo skill type of a rotational effect to it. Aside of this, they also added the correct hero set with Essence Well, Fire Breath, or Dream Breath has a chance to generate Essence Burst depending on your spec. With Twin Flame, consuming Essence Burst fires twin flames striking your target for either damage for devastation or healing for preservation. And with Fire Torrent, Twin Flame now bounces to 2 additional targets, so that becomes a little bit better for AoE content, but it makes it a lot easier to use it since you can just kind of control when you want to use up a lot of your breath ability. Final trait is going to be Ashes in Motion, where Fire Breath cooldown is reduced by 5 seconds. This is the same for both specs, so both of them, healer or DPS, get a shorter cooldown of Fire Breath, which for Devastation obviously it's more damage, but for Preservation, this allows them to play into more Fire Breath based abilities, so like convert damage into healing type of play. Up next, we have Evoker class talents, and this section is probably going to be the shortest because Evokers are still kind of a fledgling newish class, so they don't really have too many adjustments in talents. There are some important, changes, but like you'll see some of the familiar talents that just in a slightly different spot instead of like, Scarlet Patient Beat as high up here as it was. Ancient Flame is down here, but for the most part, we look through like a lot of like the upper half of the rows. It's basically the same. Where we do see some adjustments though is on the bottom tier of the rows though, but they're not that crazy. The first thing that Evokers are getting, which is a huge benefit that isn't necessarily a talent, is how Hover functions. Previously, Hover is an ability that will allow you to move really quickly in a direction and also enable the ability to cast while moving. And previously you had to spend a global, you had to stop casting in order to be able to move with Hover immediately in order to enable it. Now you can actually press hover while you're mid spell cast. So you don't even have to interrupt your rotation. Like if you're just casting spells and you're standing still and you need to move for any reason, you can just hover mid spell cast and then start moving your character around, which is going to be super nice. And I think it'll actually make Evoker a little bit easier to play, since that interaction is a little bit easier to pull off than having to stop your cast, then hover, and then you can resume casting, which will hopefully result in some smoother gameplay. Then, outside of this, Evokers get some cool new defenses like Stretch Time. While flying during Breath of Eons or Dream Breath or a Deep Breath, 100% of the damage you would take is now then dealt over 10 seconds. So if you are flying into the fray to deal damage, now if you do take damage while you're flying in, you have the staggered damage that you taken while you were flying. So this is a nice defensive in order to let you close that distance a lot easier without really putting yourself into too much danger. Twin Guardian, however, which is an upgrade talent from Rescue, has been adjusted. So instead of giving you and an ally a shield, it'll now is primarily used as a movement skill. Will grant you 100% movement speed and also allows spells to be cast while moving for 3 seconds. So that's actually really cool and gives you a bit more of that casted while mobility. Renewing Blaze has also been converted from a separate defensive into something that is now baked into Obsidian Scales, where Obsidian Scales now surrounds you with the Renewing Blaze passively, causing 100% of the damage taken during those 8 seconds to then be healed over 8 seconds. So it is just like an extra way for you to be able to combine 2 defenses together. Previously, Evokers would separate like 2 charges of Obsidian Scales as a defensive and then would use like for rotting dot damage Renewing Blaze separately. Now you can't do that anymore, but it does make that defensive combo a lot more potent. Unravel now is no longer a separate button. It instead works off of Fire Breath, specifically where Fire Breath consumes absorbed shields and an extra effectiveness to deal spell frost damage. This is actually a really good move because Unravel by itself didn't really do any ability damage. It just was there specifically for absorbs, but it made you need to bind and actually key bind just to use it. However, all specs of Evoker use Fire Breath as a base ability, so this is just a nice buff if you're ever dealing with absorb damage at any point. They also added a fun new talent called Strike from Above, which gives glide, speed, as well as the height increase buffed up by 20%. This is just a bit of extra movement, as well as actually like, when you try to like double jump with your glide ability, it gives you slightly higher hops. I think this would be a nice mobility and maybe like exploration talent for open world content, but I don't really know how good it will be overall for like overall movement. It just seems like a little like side talent that just gives you a little bit more speed, although Evokers are generally pretty mobile as is. From there, I want to move on to the spec of Devastation in terms of their talent tree, and for the most part, you're not really seeing a huge rework for Dev, but you do see a lot of buffs all across the board. Things like Animosity, which allows you, once you use the big Dragon Rage ability, when you use that, you essentially, as you cast empowerment skills during Dragon Rage, you could extend the duration of that Dragon Rage so it lasts longer. Dragon Rage is a massive burst cooldown for you. It is the biggest cooldown that plays around with your mastery, gives you a ton of resources, that is just absolutely massive as a skill. So with animosity, you can extend that skill the more often you can cast empowerment skills. And there's a number of stats and talents you can pick up and play on optimizations that you could do in order to get more empowerment abilities to extend that window. Previously, this has a cap. Now it seems that the cap has been removed. This is awesome because a lot of Evokers love that skill expression that comes with being able to chain a bunch of skills to extend that Dragon Rage for a very long time. Right now, technically, there is a soft cap in the game at 70 seconds of maximum extension, which a lot of people are not really going to hit, but 70 seconds extra on top of Dragon Rage window is a massive uptime increase, and it's going to be a lot of fun for Evokers that really love optimizing their class and playstyle to really get the most out of the burst cooldown. Shattering Star has also been reworked so now it works passively off of Eternity Surge, fires together with Eternity Surge. I can actually even hit multiple targets, so this actually is a massive damage buff that synergizes well with Eternity Surge instead of desyncing from it, and makes Eternity Surge like an opener ability that amplifies all of your damage and skills, which is actually a really good combination and just really fun. A new talent of Azure Sweep allows you, after using a it changes your Azure Strike into Azure Sweep after casting Eternity Surge. So where your actual strike only hits a number of targets, Sweep hits all nearby enemies, doing a bunch of damage. So this allows you like a big burst situation where you're using blue skills, which are really good at cleaving targets. So you can go for a big hit with a Eternity Surge, debuffs enemies with a Shattering Star, and then follow up with a huge Azure Sweep. So that'll be a massive bursty combo that'll be really good for some of those blue type skills. And finally, we can't really preview this skill right here, but the apex talent of Evoker, Devastation, we didn't know what it is, although I can't really like mouse over it right now on the talents, but we know it's called Rising Fury. And the buff reads for that talent: while Dragon Rage is active, you gain Rising Fury every 6 seconds, increasing your haste by 4%, stacking up to 5 times. Further investment into the Apex talent allows your procs to actually increase your damage by 15% once you reach 5 stacks, so that you're further increasing the effectiveness of that Dragon Rage big bursty cooldown, while also giving you even more damage. Further upgrading the Apex trait allows that buff to persist for 20 seconds once Dragon Rage ends, giving you continued haste, damage increase, as well as additionally Essence burst procs every 4 seconds, which is huge. It makes your burst as a Dev Evoker massive, gives you a bigger burst window and residual burst after that initial burst is gone. It is huge, and that's essentially all that Devastation Evokers usually ask for. The stronger that Dragon Rage and that burst window can be, the better. So they essentially are feeding into what Evokers love to see, making those big burst windows even bigger than ever before. From there, we have the spec of Preservation, which is one of my favorite healers. However, they are looking to make a number of changes to the spec. Like every other healer in the game, most healers with Midnight Alpha are losing access to interrupts, and Devastation is one of those specs that no longer has ability of Quell, so you can't interrupt enemies specifically. They're trying to adjust the way that enemies function, the roles that healers play within group content, and interrupts apparently isn't something that one healer should focus on for the most part. However, another thing that's happening to Preservation, like every other healer, it is seeing great simplifications all across the board. Not as many players play Preservation, so I'm assuming not many of you that are not familiar with it are aware, but I would say Preservation is probably one of the most complex healers to play right now. Until you get a pretty good hang of it, the combos are really satisfying, but also kind of difficult to execute at times. And what they're trying to do with Preservation is trying to simplify it compared to some of the other healers, and there's a number of things that are being done here that are actually kind of interesting, and they're going into a very wild direction this time around. First of all, the Echo mechanic is a cool mechanic that basically allows you to put this buff on allies, so your next single target skill will also then be copied over to those allies at a portion of effectiveness, which you can kind of maximize and make better through certain talents. But it allows you to basically turn a strong, bursty single target heal to cleave multiple allies, and certain spells that maybe come with a buff or something, you can spread that buff across a lot more allies. One of those mechanics that they're actually kind of cutting back on is the ability to life bind to multiple targets, where normally you will put up Echo on multiple targets and then you Verdant Embrace one to put a life bind, so as you heal yourself, you also heal the ally. Previously, you'll be able to echo all those other allies and all of them would also get life bind, so as you heal yourself, you're AoE healing the group, turning single target healing into AoE healing. That no longer is going to be a thing. Lightbind cannot be echoed anymore, so when you're using abilities like Verdant Embrace, which is a huge bursty single target heal, you can't copy that effect to other targets. You can still have that Verdant Embrace heal multiple targets in a burst window, but Live Bind cannot be copied over anymore. It is now primarily a single target skill. However, to compensate for that, Evokers do have another skill called Emerald Blossom, which is used primarily for AoE healing. So if, let's say, Echo is used primarily for like small group and burst healing for single target, but like 2 target and 3 target, Emerald Blossom will be better at like 4 and above targets. So like if any allies are stacked together, you want to kind of use Emerald Blossom to AoE heal. A lot of the Evokers recently have been able to basically ignore Emerald Blossom to do a lot more echo healing because you can spread echoes easily, but they're basically juicing up Emerald Blossom a bunch to make you want to use it, simplifying the spec of Evoker to the extent of if there's a multiple allies that are taking damage, just use Blossom. If there's few, then you would use some of the echo combos, which makes the playstyle a lot easier to pull off, reducing the complexity of healing greatly. Another thing they did is removed another empowerment skill Evoker called Spirit Bloom, which had a very unique playstyle and how you would use it. Another ability that really needed some echo management in order to maximize value completely got out of the game instead. Instead, what they're doing is taking the Dream Breath ability, which is your primary empowerment healing ability, and are just juicing it up a bunch, making it hit harder, making it a lot more consistent, and there's a bunch of other skills and passives in order to make it even stronger. So now you have like one big ability that heals everybody in front of you, again simplifying the healing even further. They also combine some skills together into a talent role like Dream Flight as well as Stasis, which allows Evokers to either use Stasis to copy certain heals and kind of load them up and unleash them in a combo, or Dream Flight, which is like a massive deep breath but like to heal allies instead, but at a 2-minute interval. So you're going to be able to use either a massive cooldown or a combo ability of Stasis, which takes a little bit of time getting used to. They also added a new way for you to be able to heal allies with either Dream Simulacrum or Wings of Liberty. With Verdant Embrace becoming a very powerful single target heal, Verdant Embrace can be augmented with Dream Simulacrum. Normally, Verdant Embrace causes you to fly to an ally to heal them, but with Dream Simulacrum, it'll now send a Simulacrum to heal the ally from a distance, while also doing even more healing, so you don't even need to move if you're someone who doesn't like movement skills as a Preservation Evoker. Or you can go with Wings of Liberty, where now you can have 2 charges of Verdant Embrace, so even more burst, but it still does have that movement component. Lastly, we have the Apex talent for Preservation, which is Maritha's Blessing, which they've actually adjusted the way that the talent works. Maritha's Blessing basically allows you Essence abilities, so mostly your Echoes or Emerald Blossoms, a chance to convert one of your bronze skills called Reversion, which is the healing over time effect, into a more powerful version called Maritha's Blessing, which does a lot more AoE healing and can actually have some scaling components, like if it heals a bunch of allies, it heals them decently for an even amount. But if it heals less allies, like if it's just one ally in a small area, it does a lot more healing to that target, so it has a bit of this like target scaling element to it. And it still gains all the benefits of Reversion on top of it, so there's a bunch of effects that basically make Reversion, which is a very strong single target heal, into kind of like a better AoE heal component. You can further augment it by going Maritha's Blessing, where Dream Breath instant healing is increased by 125%, giving even more burst healing, and Dream Breath always grants you a proc of Maritha's Blessing, which is a nice follow-up Dream Breath into Maritha's for a bunch of AoE healing. Or you could start putting points into Maritha's Blessing passive, where Reversion protects allies, reversing 2% of all damage taken, healing them instead. So then you're able to play into more burst, immediate green Dragonflight healing elements, or into the more bronze timey-wimey damage reversion components, which are kind of fun to play into as a preservation. From there, we have the spec of Augmentation, which is getting simplified by a bunch, specifically through its buff mechanic of Ebb and Might. Ebb and Might is an awesome skill that basically increases the effectiveness of your allies. So you're basically, instead of doing more damage yourself, you're buffing the effectiveness of your allies during their burst cooldowns, and that's kind of the mechanic and the complexity of the spec. But in raid content, with like Mythic raiding, you have like 20 other allies you can buff. And your positioning with Ebb and Might buffs all allies around you, so you have to be positioned carefully next to the targets you want to buff. And then you can also select some allies that you definitely want to receive a buff from with Prescience, as Prescience makes those targets higher priority for your Ebb and Might. It's a lot of targeting minutia and constantly changing around, like trying to buff up the mage during the combustion, trying to buff the hunter during the true shot, trying to buff this class and that class whenever they have their cooldowns was always a little bit confusing and complicated. So they're trying to make it easier by essentially making Ebb and Might, instead of having a target cap, they're basically making it that Ebb and Might will buff every DPS in the group, whether you're talking about a 5-man group like a Mythic Plus dungeon or a like 20 to 30 player raid. Every DPS in the group will receive a buff from Ebb and Might. The stats, however, for primary stats for Ebomite that it provides, instead of 8% of your own, it actually will scale, so the more allies you're buffing, the lower that number becomes, but it essentially allows you to give a flat or raw buff for your entire raid for everybody, instead of like a fairly sizable buff for only a handful of players. So this makes managing the Ebomite buff a lot easier. It now affects the entire raid, so this becomes very strong during like the opener when you're bloodlusting, everyone pops their cooldowns, but also maintaining those buffs throughout your raid means that everybody evenly receives some sort of an increase, so you don't have some classes doing more damage than others. Also, the ability of Breath of Eons does very similar. It will accumulate the damage of all of your allies at a higher rate, though that rate scales depending how many targets you have. So in a smaller group content like Mythic Plus or even PvP, it has a huge benefit, but in a raid setting, it does scale down naturally in order to account for some of the scaling and damage overall components. And those two mechanics, those adjustments to Ebomite as well as Breath of Eons, are actually pretty massive and a huge bulk of what is happening to Augmentation. Aside of that, we got a number of few talent changes. A lot of the talents that we've seen previously that have been around have gotten a new position, like Ignition Rush, for example, but it's like not insanely consequential. One of the more consequential changes is an upgrade to the Blistering Scales, which is like a buff you apply to the tank to make him stronger, but also give him like some explosive damage when they get hit by enemy attacks. You can now augment it with Regenerative Chitin, where Blistering Scales no longer loses charges, so you just put it up on a tank and you don't have to think about it, and will deal more damage. Or you can go with Molten Blood, where that Regenerative Scales or Blistering Scales now has a shield. Right now it looks like Regenerative seems a lot better than Molten Blood, although Molten Blood could potentially be pretty good within like Mythic Plus or PvP content, where you're looking to transfer that shield as like an on-demand defensive more regularly to play more of a support role rather than like a damage buff role. Another new talent that's here is improved Defy Fate. Defy Fate is a cheat death mechanic exclusive to Augmentation, so they're basically making it a lot more effective and have a shorter cooldown. The Augmentation Evokers actually has a bit of an advantage over Devastation because of this cheat death, where Dev can sometimes die to mechanics while Aug will just live it. So this actually just makes Augmentation Evoker stocks going forward even better heading into midnight. Your Apex talent is called Duplicate, where Breath of Eons will summon a version of you from the future to assist you in battle for about 20 seconds. Your Duplicate will cast skills like Eruption, Empowerment spells, as well as Living Flame while they're out. And you can actually augment it very similar to how healers augment their hero talents, as you can either go in the direction of Duplicate, where your Duplicate, while it's active, your Ebomite grants 100% more stats, so it's like a lot more effective for those burst cooldown. Or you can go into the more passive buff, where anytime you extend Ebomite, your Duplicate is also extended equal to either a portion or partial amount of that you extended Ebomite by. So the longer you can extend Ebomite, the longer you can have this little buddy with you, and the longer you can have the buddy, the more effective Ebomite is. So it gives you a very much burst cooldown, but through a support style mechanic, rather than a burst cooldown to buff your damage specifically even further. But with that being said, as always, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like, as I would very much appreciate it. Be sure also to join this community, especially if you want to keep up with any new updates regarding new content for either War Within, Legion Remix, or Midnight Alpha, soon to be beta. With that, let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.